what I was going to talk about, data and value in Scotland's creative industries. Creative Scotland, the organisation that I work for, has got, there's going to be a lot of small detail in these slides, but I don't expect you to read it all. I'm going to point at the important bits and hopefully explain them. Creative Scotland was set up by the Scottish government, Scottish Parliament. It was created through a bill. The bill is the Public Services Reform Act, and it gives us 6 principal priorities that we work to. And the one that I look after is this number 6, which actually says promoting and supporting industries and other commercial activity, the primary focus of which is the application of creative skills. And obviously wrapped up in that, there's a whole load of things that you can start to try and unpick. So, you know, what the hell do we mean by commercial? What the hell do we mean by creative skills? All those things kind of need unpicking. So I'm not going to get too bogged down in the semantics, which I will often do if you want me to, but I'm going to try and gloss over that and just go straight in and talk about how we're beginning to work in that area. The work that I do involves me working in partnership with quite a lot of other people, principally the enterprise agencies who are charged by the Scottish Government with supporting the development of economic value within Scotland. And so consequently, I work across Business Gateway, Scottish Funding Council, Scottish Enterprise, Highlands and Islands Enterprise, Skills Development Scotland, who are all meant to be pulling in the same direction towards developing the economy in Scotland. Now, within that, there's a whole load of things wrapped up. What do we mean by the economy? And that's the thing that I want to try and explore a little bit as we go through this. We do a whole range of projects. I'm not going to talk through all of them. In fact, I think this one might be in this room. Is that in this room? Yes, yeah. We support lots of things, but principally what we're trying to do is to help to grow sustainable creative businesses. So a few quick headline statements about the work that I'm currently engaged with within Creative Scotland. So the first thing is that everyone has got the capacity to be creative. That's a given, and I kind of I reject wholeheartedly that there are creative people and there are non-creative people. Everybody has got the capacity to be creative. Some people are motivated to turn that creativity into the basis for how they live, work or study. So we can all do it, some of us choose to use it in a certain way. So what then happens is that through that action we create things, and those things have got the capacity to generate value in lots of different forms. And the way I try and work is that I break down those forms of value into cultural, social and economic. Now there's a rationale behind that which links back to the principles that Bourdieu laid out in his Capitals. I won't go into that just now, but essentially that's the position that I adopt and I try and work with, that there are 3 principal sets of value that as humans we regard as assets in terms of how we function. I'm interested in how they scale out into communities and into society more broadly. They're all independent forms of value, and I'm going to come back to this and probably labour this point massively through the process of this talk. They're all independent forms of value, and each is measured and understood differently. Now, this is quite important because what it means is that the data that tells us whether or not we're succeeding here is not necessarily going to be the data that tells us we're succeeding here or here, and that we need to understand what do we mean by data when we're actually talking about some of those other forms of value. Okay, much creativity is supported through the market. So a lot of the things that we do in terms of our creative lives, we just go out and we buy stuff. We buy tickets, we buy CDs, we buy downloads, we pay for our Netflix subscription or whatever. But some is not supported by the market and can benefit from public support. And that's often where we come in as an organisation. So our role is often to try and address these areas where creative activity, in order to be at the most benefit for the most people, needs to have some measure of intervention to help that to happen. And this gets especially complicated when we're talking about this area of the creative industries. Okay, so our role is looking to make sure that risk, access and market failure do not stop great things from happening for as many people as possible. Now this is not official Creative Scotland policy. This is something we are working with at the moment in terms of our thinking for the next stage of how we move forward. They're quite tricky terms. Terms like market failure are quite loaded. but I think we want to try and explore what do we mean by that. But principally, this is about a better understanding of the principles of access and engagement, the kind of equalities questions, but also the inclusion questions that are going to make our approach to creativity as cohesive as a national project. Okay, so the focus of our work, essentially we align with the Scottish Government economic strategy, which has these 4 I's: investment, innovation, inclusive growth and internationalisation. But essentially what we do is we try and intervene, we try and make interventions that are about the growth of sustainable creative businesses. So it's plural, we don't invest in individual businesses, we try and do things that help other people to help businesses, creative businesses, to grow. What do we mean by creative? What do we mean by business? What do we mean by sustainable? All questions I think that we probably need to be debating. Okay, what do we know about the creative industries in Scotland? Well, it's an interesting sector. I don't know that these are necessarily views that are shared by everyone, but just to give you some pointers about the particular characteristics of this sector, it's a highly qualified and highly motivated sector, which the flip side of which is that it's quite an exclusive sector. So the demographics of the creative industry sector are not great. It has short value chains, so in a sense that it's not a very integrated sector, so people who often make things are the same people that are selling things. There are low interdependencies, so there are lots and lots of different sectors that don't necessarily talk to each other, and they'll do their own thing. They're all part of what the government and we might describe as the creative industries, but they're not necessarily engaged with each other in any way, shape or form. It's geographically distributed. There are creative industries everywhere across Scotland, and it's a big area for interest, investment, engagement within rural areas as much as it is within urban areas. And lastly, there's this notion there's a strong alignment with the grant-aided sector. So a lot of what happens that is classified as creative industries exists because it gets support from the state. In addition to that, there are lots of things that happen that don't get support from the state, but they all inhabit this same playground of activity. And that makes it quite tricky sometimes to navigate what's going on in those areas. Okay, jump back. So one of the challenges that we've got is how do we balance those different forms of value in terms of the interventions that we make? So when we're engaging with something, how do we understand whether or not, if we're putting a grant into something or if we're backing a project, that it's actually generating cultural value, social value and economic value all at the same time? Well, it's probably not going to happen all at the same time in the same form, but one of the challenges we've got is to try and understand what's happening when we make those interventions. Secondly, we need to do this now in absolutely in the context of equalities, diversity and inclusion, which is a fundamental principle that we as a public body are working with. And this covers not only, I guess, the legal requirements that we have as a public body, which is principally defined by the Equality Act, as we heard earlier, but also these much more complex notions around inclusion, which include things like economic exclusion. How do we understand we're making interventions which are fundamentally about economic development? How do we make sure that we're doing it in a way that enables those kinds of processes of inclusion to happen? We need to understand where growth can occur. If we're looking to try and build things up, where's that going to happen? How do we actually make interventions at points where we can really make a difference, rather than just backing things that are already succeeding or being asked to deal with areas that are failing, which are never ever going to succeed. So you just end up becoming creating money pits. And lastly, how do we deal with this whole issue of the public sector nurturing things and not necessarily controlling things? We as an organisation are quite aware of the often paternalistic nature that funding implies. And so how do we back off that and work in partnership with people rather than necessarily taking that view, which is that we set the terms, then other people work within those terms. How do we co-design the creative future of Scotland? And they're the kind of challenges that we're trying to work with at the moment. So, why are we talking about it? Well, this guy, some of you will remember this, Chris Smith, was in the Labour government, UK Labour government in the mid-90s. He came up with the concept of placing the creative industries in the heart of government and making it something that was a principal policy agenda of New Labour at that time. He made a lot of arguments to position it within the policy of that government, and since that time it's rolled out globally. That the concept of creative and cultural industries have been around for longer than that, but at this point it really became cemented as a public policy agenda. And consequently, we have these massive statements that now emerge on a regular basis that provide us with nominally data, statistical information about what's happening in this area. But obviously, you will see these things, they will come flying around, people will quote them at you about the number of jobs, and this thing that I hear quite a lot but really gets my goat, which is the notion of the contribution to the economy. The economy is not something separate from us. We don't contribute to the economy as being distinct from our own lives. The economy is us. So actually, industries contributing to the economy, it's a nonsensical concept, and I struggle with that quite a lot. So how do we work within this framework of kind of hubris around what this sector is doing and where it can be going? There's this campaign, Creativity is Great, that's run by the Creative Industries Council, and it throws in all these statistics about the growth of the sector. They generate £9.6 million per hour. You know, how do we know this? And so actually, a lot of my work has been trying to dig under the hood of this to try and work out where do these numbers come from? What do they actually mean? And what's the gap between where these numbers are coming from and the kind of understanding and the pitch that we're making in terms of what's going on in this sector. So, one of my favourite pieces of academic research is this paper by Eleonora Belfiore. I don't know if people know Eleonora. She was at Warwick. I think she's now at Loughborough. But she wrote this great paper, which was, it's called On Bullshit in Cultural Policy Practice and Research, Notes from the British Case. And it's an analysis of a lot of the things that Chris Smith said in the birth of the creative industries in the UK and setting those against the facts of the matter. And what it does is it actually uses, it's Harry Frankfurt who wrote the book On Bullshit, which actually sets out the concept of bullshit as an academic concept, which actually is about how people, they establish an agenda that they want to pursue, and then they selectively locate the facts or the data or the evidence that will support that agenda. So it's another term for, I think, what we sometimes call at Creative Scotland, policy-led evidence. So we have a policy, go away and find some evidence that proves that that policy works. Now, obviously, that's something that I find quite problematic, and I think when we're talking about data, a lot of the time where we find ourselves landing is actually how can we find the data to prove what we already believe? And for me, that's just completely wrong. There's detail in the paper. I won't go through this because I've got other stuff to talk about in the slides, but I recommend digging out the paper and having a look at it. It's a short paper, really good read though. Okay, what happens off the back of that? Okay, so we start kind of sharing this hubris. We start talking about how important it is that if we do this creative stuff, it's going to generate all of this money for the economy. And so what happens, this is a page from the Dundee Evening Telegraph back in 2012, when Dundee announced it was going to bid to be the UK capital of culture. And what the telly did was it just ran this massive story, a city of culture is a city of cash. And I quite like this because they're being quite honest about the perspective that a lot of people will have about the value of doing something like this. And again, it sets up the challenge for us. How do we actually get beyond this? How do we get beyond this point where the only purpose of doing creative and cultural activity is so that cash will rain from the sky? Now, okay, there might be some cash that rains from the sky at some point in that process, but that's not why we're doing it. And I think we need to try and get to grips with some of that. Okay, so I'm just going to go through some data now. This is about Scotland's economy. I don't know how many people study the Scottish Government economic strategy and the policies that the Scottish Government has been pursuing for the last few years. But it talks about 6 growth sectors of the Scottish economy. When it first wrote these, it included a seventh one, and the seventh one was universities, interestingly enough. Because actually I think they struggled to work out exactly what the economic impact with universities actually was. It was very, very difficult to include it, I think, in terms of the ongoing statistical information around this. But basically, these are the areas where the Scottish Government think the future of the economy lies: food and drink, creative industries, sustainable tourism, energy, financial and business services, and life sciences. So what do we know about those? Okay, here we go, first animated graph. First of all, food and drink employs 111,000 people in 17,330 businesses. Creative industries, 84,000 people. I won't read out all the numbers, but you'll see what happens. Sustainable tourism, lots of people employed, smaller number of businesses. Energy, 70,000 people in 3,920 businesses. Finance and business services, lots of people, small number of businesses. Life sciences, not that many people in not that many businesses. Now, these are the Scottish Government's own statistics. So if you think about how we characterise industry in Scotland, I don't know if this is necessarily the picture that most of us have in our head. And consequently, it's why you will often hear politicians and people who work for Creative Scotland standing up and talking about the fact that the creative industries employs more people than the oil and gas sector. And I think what was the other one?
It's not oil and gas because that's renewable.
No, that's oil and gas as well. That includes oil and gas. That's not just renewables.
Because you just bracket renewable in the earliest.
No, that's the oil and gas sector in there. Yes. So that's the growth sector is renewables. This is the statistics of how they're counting people working in that sector. So that's the Scottish Government's own numbers. Now, I'm not proclaiming that I can completely unpick all these numbers and know exactly where these people come from, but this is the Scottish Government's own numbers. So this tells us what the Scottish Government understands the nature of employment in the key growth sectors to be. So moving on, creative industries is 9% of businesses in Scotland. It's 3% of jobs and 5% of jobs in the UK. So as a percentage, the number of jobs in the creative industries in Scotland is slightly smaller than it is in the UK, rest of the UK. But this is where it gets really interesting, is that we measure them differently in Scotland from how we measure them in the rest of the UK. So basically, although quite often you will see these kinds of statistics side by side, the Scottish Government counts jobs in Scotland one way, and the UK Government counts jobs in Scotland another way. So these statistics are very, very hard to follow. One of the things that comes up quite often when I talk to colleagues in Scottish Government about these particular issues is that what they then say is that these are proxy numbers. The important point about these numbers is not the absolute values, it's the change over time. So in effect, the only real value of these numbers is what happens to them year on year. And as long as they're consistent with counting them in the same way year on year, you get some indication of trends. The problem is that we keep changing how we count them. So our ability to then track those trends becomes incredibly limited. So we can look back, I think, about 6 or 7 years in terms of consistent trends within the Scottish numbers. But there was a big stooshy over how we counted certain things in Scotland, which meant that we massively changed the way we counted the numbers around the creative industries. And that stooshy was largely a Dundee-based one because it was about how we included computer games. Because most computer games manufacturers classified themselves as toy makers, according to their industrial classification, which meant that when Creative Scotland with Scottish Enterprise did a big report about the creative industries, it said that according to the statistics, the computer games industry in Scotland is worth nothing. It was worth a very small number, which of course upset everybody in the computer games industry to this day. But the point was that they were not classified as being part of the creative industries at the point at which they undertook that count. So part of the process of undertaking that count was to redefine the creative industries in Scotland by including computer games, which meant that we parted company with the way in which they were counted in the rest of the UK. Yes. Okay, so what is the sector? So the creative industries in Scotland are made up of 16 subsectors. In the rest of the UK, they're made up of 13 subsectors, and that's a list of them. You can have a guess as to which one you think is the biggest, and most people don't get this right. We have really interesting perceptions over what we think is actually going on in this sector. The detail of it looks like this. You can't see the detail of this, which you'll be very lucky to know, but these are all standard industrial classifications. Every time when you create a business, you register your business, you are assigned an industrial classification that defines the type of business that you are. The creative industries economic statistics are made up of all of these classifications being aggregated into producing a single number. Oh, I'm going to skip through this because this is the games thing. So, the games sector in Scotland, sorry, the creative industries sector in Scotland, this is the turnover by subsector. This is the data from, I think, that the most recent data, 2018, which is data from 2016. So they publish it in 2018, but it's actually numbers that came about in 2016. So smallest one is cultural education. These are all millions of pounds, turns over 11 million pounds. And I will zip through, I won't explain all of them. Next smallest is music. Next smallest is photography, and as so on, I'll click through them. Computer games, still pretty small. Crafts and antiques, film and video. Many of you will be aware that there's been a lot of noise recently about the screen sector in Scotland. You'll see how the Scottish Government actually records the data that equates to the size of that sector here in a moment. Fashion, textiles, advertising, architecture, writing and publishing, design, and then finally software and electronic publishing. So most of the statistics that you read about the creative industries, both in the UK and in Scotland, are carried massively by this sector. It's more than half of the sector. Now, this is kind of problematic because this is not necessarily what most people think of when they think of the creative industries. This is people writing computer programs to do all kinds of things, not just to make computer games. Computer games are counted separately now. So what we've got here is people making programs, writing databases, a whole range of things that we as people working in the creative sector might not necessarily think of when we think of creative industries. We tend to think of film and video, visual art, music, as the key things that we think of as the creative industries. And the flip side of that is also true, that most people working in this sector don't have the slightest interest in being part of the thing that we call the creative industries. They're getting on with it, they're succeeding, they don't necessarily align themselves with anything that exists as a policy within this area. So to some extent, a lot of the rhetoric around the creative industries is to do with the success of it, in numerical terms, being done on the back of this activity here. Now, you may think, from my perspective, that's a kind of tricky thing to say because my job is Director of Creative Industries and I'm saying that the biggest part of the creative industries is not necessarily what we think about as the creative industries. But there's something else that's quite important here, which is to do with the fact that there's something else going on in the creative industries, and that's the thing that I want to go on to talk about. Now, one of the really tricky things to get your head around is once you start to dig into these economic statistics, you start bumping up against a whole range of jargon. Now, does everybody in the room know what GVA is? Does anybody in the room know what GVA is? Okay, right, that's good. Okay, well, GVA is gross value added, and it's in effect the profit that a sector makes. So if you work in a conventional industry, let's say you make roast coffee. You buy your coffee beans, you roast your coffee, you package it up, you label it up, you market it, and you deliver it to the end user. Now, the gross value added is your whole turnover of your business minus what it costs you to buy in those coffee beans. So in effect, it's the profit that you're making as a sector. Now, what's quite interesting about the creative industries is that it has this quite fascinating ratio of GVA to turnover. Now, what that means is that if you are a small creative industries business, you might be not turning over very much money, but because a lot of the raw material that you're using is your own creativity, you're actually generating quite a lot of profit in relation to your turnover. So if we look at, I'm not going to go through these one by one, but basically the worst area for the turnover to GVA ratio is wholesale and retail. So basically you buy stuff in and you resell it. That's where you get the smallest profits. And as you go through these different sectors, you find over here, computer games suddenly leaps right up to the top because it's one of those areas where basically all you need is a brain, a few fingers, and a computer. And that's your raw materials that you're working with. So as you work back through these, it's sort of logical. You can see that perhaps the investment that's required in different areas of this. And to give you the example, the best example that I've found is that the best one of all in terms of the GVA to turnover ratio of Scotland's industries is sewerage. Because actually the raw materials of sewerage are delivered to you free. And the service that you provide and the charge that you make for it is essentially all profit. So, and beyond this, there's a one that's a complete, I was going to swear then, it does your brain in to think about. The highest GVA to turnover ratio that exists within the Scottish economy and the biggest industry in Scotland is people who own their own homes but don't rent them back to themselves. And that's counted in the economic statistics. So when we talk about the size of the Scottish economy, it includes everybody who owns a house but doesn't rent it back to themselves. It just does my head in. I cannot work out who came up with that as a concept because it just boosts all our numbers. So the Scottish economy is massively amplified by this very simple concept. I can give you the web link if anyone's interested to go and read about that, but it is quite incredible. Okay, so sensible stuff. We reckon there's about 15,500 creative industries businesses in Scotland. Gave you some of these numbers before, but the thing that characterises most of them is that they are very small. If you take away the top 2% of those businesses, the average size of the business is about 4 people. And just around about 58% is single person businesses. So it's effectively somebody just running a business as themselves, and there's quite a lot of them out there. Now I was going to talk a little bit about geographies and places within this as well, because one of the things that we have to do as a national body is think quite hard about how we relate back to our understanding of place. Now, I'd ask that you don't photograph this one, because this is a piece of internal working that I've been looking at myself to try and understand how we make interventions. Now, what we have here is that we have a whole load of local authorities here. I've done this for all the local authorities. This is the turnover of the creative industries in that local authority area. This is the amount of grant that they receive from Creative Scotland. This is the population, oh, that's got a pound sign, shouldn't have a pound sign. This is the population of that local authority area. So this is the creative industries turnover per capita in that area. This is the Creative Scotland investment in that area per capita. And what I then did, and this is the dangerous bit, is that I produced a ratio of creative industries, so industry activity, to Creative Scotland spend, which produces this intervention rate number. Now this is quite dangerous stuff, because what this says is that in some areas, Western Isles, Orkney, Argyll and Bute, Angus, we're actually investing at a very high ratio compared to areas like West Lothian and Falkirk. Now, it begs the question, is that right? Is that the right kind of balance? This doesn't tell us anything about whether or not that's the right way for us to be doing this, but it actually tells us that there are things going on here, that we have some areas where we have lots of activity, some areas where we have not much activity, and we as a body are making interventions in relation to that activity going on. Now, I'd argue that, yeah, it probably is a good idea for us to be investing in the Western Isles and in the Orkney Islands around growing the creative sector there, and partly because there's a lot of activity there that is probably below the radar of the economic statistics. because we know that because we're working with people on the ground there. But this kind of use of data is something that we don't get into very often because actually it produces some really, really difficult numbers, some sensitivities that we really have to try and play out in conversation with peers, like here, to try and better understand what does this actually mean? What are we doing things correctly here? And are these the right kind of figures of intervention? Because it's never going to be one-to-one, and it's never going to be equal across all these areas. To assume that it would be fatuous. So what's the right kind of intervention that we should be happening here? And that's something that I guess I'm just going to leave hanging in the air.
What have you blocked out?
Oh, sorry. Basically, it's 32 local authorities. So they're just the bottom two, and these are the top whatever. So there's about kind of 15 missing there. No, but we probably no subsector numbers aren't available on a local authority basis. It's only aggregated. Yeah. We could probably try and get the data and do that as an exercise. I would rather get somebody a PhD going off and doing that than me trying to do it in my spare time. But yeah. Okay, so narrowing it down and bringing it closer to home. The 4 biggest cities of Scotland, Aberdeen, Dundee, Edinburgh and Glasgow. Population, total business turnover, so all the businesses that are working in that local authority area. Creative industries turnover per capita, the number of regularly funded organisations that exist, and they're the organisations that we fund on a regular basis, and then the Creative Scotland grant per capita. Now, when I used to work in Dundee, I actually used these numbers as part of my funding application for regular funding, because what it demonstrates is that on a per capita basis, you've got Edinburgh, £43 per person, Glasgow, £30 per person, Dundee, £22 per person, Aberdeen, £7.30 per person. So you get this kind of ratio of 1, 2, 3, and then a third here. And what's the right level? Now, I don't know what the right level is. We need to have that debate. But the big issue here is for a city like Aberdeen, which is a massive city, which has been kind of resting on the laurels of its oil and gas sector for such a long time, has completely underdeveloped its ability to build a creative sector because it's not asking for support to do that. Maybe it's happening through another route, I don't know. But when you look at the size of the industry there, it's a reasonable size. So maybe it's a sustainable creative sector and it actually doesn't need Creative Scotland support. So these are quite interesting numbers and numbers that I'm trying to work with to understand how we make interventions on both a sectoral basis but also on a place basis, because they're the 2 lenses that we're trying to use to look and see what goes on in these areas. Okay, so I'm going to finish off. Am I doing all right for time?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay, this is my challenge at the moment. So I'm going to all that stuff I've talked about up till now, which is kind of the challenge of the data, is kind of encapsulated in this thing that I want to share with you now. So this is the cultural experience. This is the creative business. This is the thing that we are all trying to do. Okay, how do we know what's going on here? So you arrive, you get on, and you pay your admission. We have the ability to work out an objective value at this point. We know that we have 8 people in these cars, they're paying a £5 a head, we have an instant assessment of value. Okay, the car sets off, I can't animate it, I'm sorry to say, starts riding on its journey, and we start to hit the domain of social value. Who's in the car with me? Who are these people? Are they enjoying themselves? Do I like them? Are they people that I think I want to ride with? Are they on the same journey as me? Where are we all going together? So in this space, we start to explore the social value. Now, do we have any way of counting that? Not really. There are people that attempt to do it, but probably not. Okay, we come down the big slope and we hit the big loop-the-loop, okay? Subjective value kicks in. Shit, I'm scared. This is about me. This is my point when I'm actually just entirely experiencing this within the realms of my own world. I don't care what anybody else around me is doing. This is just about me. So I'm flying around here upside down. all of my thoughts are focused on me, what I'm doing, what I feel about it, where is this taking me. You come off, you've had your subjective experience, you come round, you're chilling out, and this is where the interesting one kicks in, the intersubjective value. Was everybody else as scared as me? Did everybody else feel the same kind of anxieties I felt? Did they laugh at me? Did they think I was too scared? Did they think I was not scared enough? Did they think I was entertained by this? Are they new friends? Are they people I'm going to bond with? What do we all think of this kind of experience? Do we all think the same thing about it? Do we all feel that the value that we're taking away from this is something that we all share? And this is not the same as the social value one. This is about us having been part of something, and the value of it is something that exists between us. So none of us actually own it. It's something that is about all of the sum of those subjective values being played out in the nuances and subtleties of human interaction in a shared experience. Now, you come rattling along, you come down the slope, and you complete. Now, you get out and you walk down. What's that experience been about? Now, the only thing we do when we actually assess these experiences is we look at that bit. Now, how much of that is to do with the significance of that experience? Now, we can argue that that's the point in which all of these other things crystallize into a transactional exchange, and that's where you understand what the value is that people place upon all these different things. But our articulation of all these other things, all these other notions of value that we are engaging with, is often so underdeveloped and so immature and so irrelevant, we believe, to the rest of the things we're doing in our life, that we always fall back on this. And that for me is a major, major issue, because I'm working with a sector that produces value massively in all these areas. The very definition of intersubjective value is fashion. It's something that has no principal notion of an objective value or even a subjective value. You do it because actually you want to go out and you want to get those responses and you want to feel that the thing that you're doing is something that isn't just you, it exists between you and a peer group who are around you who will recognize the value in the thing that you are developing through your subjectivity. That's all the stuff of the creative industries. But this is where we come back and talk about the value of what it is we're doing. Now, I don't know what I can do about that. I think partly I just wanted to drop that into this conversation because this is the thing that I'm wrestling with at the moment. I don't think this is about numbers. This isn't about numbers. This isn't about numbers. It's not even always about words, because the beauty of this area is that yes, it might be about words, but those words can change in an instant. So the value that exists in that intersubjective space can change like that. And it's a value that is not transactional in the same way as this value is. It's fascinating, and we're a million miles away from understanding what's going on in these other areas. So one of the things that I'm, I guess, reaching out to academics for is to try and provide me, in a policy environment, with the tools that I can use to make sure that all these things are working in the best way possible for the sectors that I'm currently engaged with. So that's me. Thank you. Oh, sorry, yeah.